As I've mentioned a couple times before, I read a lot. And while I tend to read a vast variety of genres, from my yearly reading of Beowulf to, random science fiction, it's the random science fiction and fantasy that I always seem to come back to. And I can't pinpoint exactly why that's what I enjoy so much, but I'm probably going to blame either giant robots, Tom Swift, or the Chronicles of Narnia. It's probably one of their fault. Now, in my reading of science fiction especially, it's curious to note how different authors create the tone of their universe. See, there's kind of two different ways to go when it comes to science fiction. Everything is either good or bad. And there's really not a whole lot of middle ground when it comes to science fiction. So you've got the kind that's what they call utopian. And that's the first two versions of Star Trek is kind of that. It paints this picture that everything is great. Humanity has overcome all of its failings. There's no more greed. There's no more racism. There's no more sexism. And everything's wonderful. Star Trek is actually a pretty good example of this because it made some very interesting casting decisions that wouldn't have been normal for its time. For example, the helmsman, played by George Takei, was an Asian American. And as George Takei has said before, that was a time when mostly what he was getting was stereotypes and dubs. And that was about all he did. The communications officer, Lieutenant Uhura, was an African-American woman who was on the bridge, being important. At one time, she was frustrated with the show and was getting ready to quit, and no one less than Martin Luther King Jr. sat her down and said, no, you can't leave this show. This is really good. You need to keep going. Now, if Star Trek is an example of utopian science fiction, there's been a trend lately to what's called dystopian science fiction. Most of us have probably heard of the big names in dystopian science fiction. 1984, Fahrenheit 451. But the genre's made a big comeback lately with movies and novels like The Hunger Games or Divergent or V for Vendetta. It's this idea that humanity hasn't overcome any of its failings, and it usually involves some big government trying to get into everyone's lives, controlling everything, and basically being incredibly corrupt. Now, what's really curious about this is if you look through history, you can see how arts and literature tends to follow culture. After World War I, for example, most writing took a considerably darker turn than the optimism of the very early part of the 20th century. And, well, makes you wonder something about where our culture's going when you start seeing dystopian literature show up again. But what's interesting is if you read the Bible, you might notice something, and it's not that everything is perfect. I mean, if you were going to categorize the Bible into utopian versus dystopian, it would definitely be dystopian, because the world is not as it should be. Things are going wrong, and there is a problem. Humanity hasn't overcome anything. Now, how does this fit? See, the Bible tells us that we have an oppressive regime running the world, namely sin. But there's something else. See, you've read dystopian literature like 1984 or the like. There's always a group that's fighting against that. Have you ever noticed that? 1984, he finds this group that's fighting against Big Brother. And while in 1984 it doesn't exactly end well for him, in other books it does. The whole point of the Hunger Games is someone stands up against the government and eventually, well, she's probably going to win. The third movie hasn't come out yet, and I haven't read the books yet because I don't want to spoil the books by reading or spoil the movies by reading the books yeah. You know how that goes, right? So there's always this group that's fighting against the oppressive regime. And in the same way that God's people are called to fight against the sin that's in the world. Now, in Romans, Paul is writing about this fight. He spent a good portion of the book of Romans up to this point, leading up to Jesus shows up to make everything better. But he spends a lot of time talking about sin and how sin is everywhere. And finally he says, but you know what? That's not the end. Because the Spirit of God now lives in us to fight against our sinful nature. Because the Spirit lives in us, we're no longer part of that sinful culture. We're no longer part of Big Brother's regime. Instead, we are God's children. We're co-heirs with Christ and are filled with hope. But our hope isn't for a Star Trek-like humanity being better on its own. No, our hope is for something even better than that. Our hope is this promise that creation is going to be even better than it has ever been. And it's the promise that there won't even be death. The image that we have of this new creation is more perfect than we can even imagine. And even the hints that we get in Ezekiel and Revelation just seem so fantastic that it's almost hard to believe. But it's not just us that's waiting with this hope. Paul writes also that all of creation is waiting as if it's in labor for this new creation to be birthed. It's waiting to be redeemed. And it's the same hope that we all share that Isaiah writes about. We've been going through Isaiah in adult Sunday school, and you might remember that the first 40 chapters are not the most hopeful. The first 40 chapters talk about death and destruction and punishment, but then it's like a switch flips. And the reading from Isaiah that we have today, saying, don't tremble, don't be afraid, is the start of a different look. It's a start of Isaiah not preaching doom and gloom, but preaching hope, but preaching a light. It's even what leads the psalmist to say, and rejoice in God, even when everyone around him is trying to get him. It's that hope for something better. Hope is a powerful thing. And it's important for us to remember that we don't hope in vain. The hope that we have for this redeeming of the whole world, it's a ways off. We don't know when God's going to do all of these things that he's promised, but we can look back on the other things that he's promised and has fulfilled. So we know that he's good for it. Because God has promised to renew creation. He has promised to end the reign of sin in this world and replace it with his reign, with his Son on the throne. To replace it with a place where there is no more death, there's no more crying, there's no more pain, where perfect is normal, and where God is in charge of everything. And we reign with him as his children. This is the hope that we cling to when we go through times that are hard. This is the hope that we cling to when there's nothing else left. It's the hope that we cling to when the world of sin looks like it's winning. Because in the end, God is good on his promises. He will hold true. And one day we know that our hope will not be in vain.